The snow fell with a lethal, unyielding weight over Seoul that night, a white shroud for a city already hiding behind locked doors. But on a quiet residential street, the warmth of home was a weapon. Amara Hayes stood on her own porch, her thin cardigan damp from the freezing mist, her knees trembling as much from the cold as the terror that had finally broken. Inside the house, her stepfather, Marcus Hale, stood in the frame of the window, a silhouette of cold indifference against the golden glow of the living room. He didn't care that her father was gone, or that Amara had spent years acting as a human shield for her mother. Out of sheer, unhinged rage, he shoved her through the door and through the lock. "I'm done catering to your rebellion," he spat through the glass. "Find somewhere else to freeze." Amara didn't scream. She didn't have the strength left. She turned toward the street, her light boots sinking into the drifts, her breath hitching in weak, broken clouds. She made it halfway to the corner before her legs, already life-tired from years of surviving under Marcus's thumb, simply gave out. She collapsed onto the icy pavement, her fingers curling into the snow. Marcus watched from the window, then turned away to the warmth he felt he'd earned. What he didn't know, what he could never have guessed, was that a black sedan had just stopped at the corner. The man stepping out of it, jaw tight and eyes locked with terrifying intensity on Amara's huddled form, was Jun Hyuk Kang. To the world, he was a ruthless Korean mafia boss. But as he dropped to his knees in the ice to wrap his cashmere coat around her, he knew only one thing. The girl freezing in the snow was the only person who made his world worth holding. Amara spent years being a human shield for her mother, only to be left to die in the cold while her stepfather watched from a warm window. If you were standing on that street, would you have the courage to step in like Jun Hyuk, or would you have looked away too? Be honest, tell us in the comments. Before we proceed with the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments, and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. The transition from the lethal, biting wind of the Seoul streets to the interior of Jun Hyuk's black sedan was a sensory blur that felt like being pulled back from the edge of a jagged cliff. Amara Hayes barely felt the shift. Her body was no longer her own, but a hollow shell of violent shivers and fatting consciousness. Her vision was a fractured mosaic of streetlights and falling ice, but the one thing she could feel was the sudden, overwhelming warmth of the man who had claimed her from the pavement. Jun Hyuk didn't wait for his driver to assist or for the world to witness his vulnerability. He lifted her from the icy ground with a protective intensity so fierce it felt like a silent war cry against the house she had just been exiled from. His arms formed a cradle of muscle and expensive wool, providing the first solid ground Amara had stood on in 3 years of surviving Marcus Hale's domestic terror. As he slid into the back seat, he didn't set her down. He pulled her flush against his chest, her head falling naturally against the hollow of his shoulder. He wrapped his cashmere coat around her trembling frame, his hands moving with a frantic precision that betrayed the calm mask of his face. The heater in the car was humming, a low growl of luxury that felt alien to a girl who had just been told she was worthless by the man meant to protect her. Jun Hyuk's jaw remained tight, a hard line of bone and fury, as he watched the weak, broken clouds of her breath slowly begin to steady against his shirt. He didn't speak a single word during the ride, but his thumb traced a rhythmic, possessive line over her knuckles, as if he were counting the seconds to ensure her heart didn't stop before they reached his gates. When the car finally pulled into the subterranean garage of his Glass and Steel Needle in Gangnam, the staff moved with the practiced, terrifying efficiency of a shadow army. They had seen Jun Hyuk carry injured lieutenants and bloodied allies through these doors before, but they had never seen him carry a woman. He bypassed the primary guest suites, moving deeper into the penthouse to a room that felt more like a fortress than a bedroom. The air here was heavy with the scent of lilies and filtered warmth. He laid her on the bed, a vast expanse of white silk and charcoal pillows, and for a moment he simply stood over her, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a dark vow. The private physician arrived within minutes, a man who knew better than to ask why the most feared man in the city was standing over a shivering girl in a damp cardigan with such focused concern. He moved with a quiet reverence, treating the early signs of hypothermia and setting up a quiet IV drip to replenish the life that the blizzard had nearly extinguished. Jun Hyuk did not leave. He sat in the heavy velvet chair beside the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on her face with a gaze that moved over her features like a man reading a sacred text. He noticed everything: the way her curly hair was matted with melting ice, the life-tired exhaustion that lived in the dark circles under her eyes, and the memories of pain that lived in the way she flinched even in her sleep. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the penthouse sat high above the glowing kingdom of Seoul, but Jun Hyuk remained tethered to that bedside. He watched her sleep the way a man watches something he lost and never expected to find again. The girl from the porch wasn't just a victim to him. She was the only soft thing in a life he had made entirely of sharp edges, and as he watched her breathe, the patient and terrible decision to dismantle Marcus Hale's world began to take its final, lethal shape in his mind. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, a stark contrast to the screaming winds she had been abandoned to. But even in her dreams, Amara looked like she was waiting for a blow to fall. Jun Hyuk reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from her cheek, wanting to touch her but knowing that his hands were only built for destruction. He pulled back, his fingers curling into a fist against his knee as he recalled the image of Marcus watching from the window while she collapsed. The fury that burned in him was cold, systematic, and entirely dedicated to ensuring that the girl on the bed would never have to wake up afraid again. When the doctor finally signaled that the danger had passed, Jun Hyuk didn't relax. He dismissed his staff with a silent flick of his wrist, wanting to be the only thing she saw when she finally returned to the world. He watched the snowfall against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights below flickering like jewels he had conquered, but found no joy in until this very moment. Amara Hayes was his sanctuary now, just as he was becoming hers, even if she didn't know it yet. As the first sliver of gray light began to touch the horizon, Amara shifted under the silk sheets, a soft moan escaping her lips that sounded more like a plea than a sound of comfort. Jun Hyuk leaned in closer, his jaw tight, his entire existence narrowed down to the rhythm of her heartbeat. He was a man who dealt in blood and shadows, but in this room, under the watchful eyes of the Seoul skyline, he was simply a protector waiting for his queen to wake. He knew that when she opened her eyes, the war would truly begin, but for now, in the stillness of the penthouse sanctuary, he allowed himself the luxury of simply watching her live. The morning light did not gently announce itself. It cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like a clinical blade, illuminating the terrifying luxury Amara had been thrust into. Her eyes flew open, not with the soft haze of someone waking from a peaceful dream, but with the sharp, jagged panic of a woman who had trained herself to wake up afraid. She sat up so fast her vision blurred into a dizzying smear of silk curtains and unfamiliar, expansive ceilings. The silence of the room was heavy, a stark contrast to the screaming, predatory winds of the night before, yet it felt just as suffocating. Then, her gaze landed on the man sitting in the velvet chair. Jun Hyuk was still there. He had not changed his clothes, and his dark eyes were unreadable as he let her see him. Recognition hit her face like a physical slap, her eyes widening as the memories of the snow, the weak, broken clouds of her breath, and the weight of his cashmere coat flooded back. She looked at the room, at the medical equipment that had tethered her back to life, and then at the black titanium ring he had placed on the nightstand while she slept. It was a cold, heavy declaration of intent that felt more like a contract than a romantic gesture. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice cracking, the fire in her eyes masking the fact that her hands were still trembling with the aftershocks of trauma. "Because you were dying, and I have spent 5 years regretting the moments I didn't stop to save you," Jun Hyuk replied, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp that made the air in the room feel dangerously thin. He did not offer her a glass of water or a false comfort. He leaned in, his sharp jawline highlighted by the winter sun, and looked at her with an intensity that suggested he was already mapping out her future. "I want you to stay, Amara. I want you to be my bride. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I am the only one who can ensure you never have to look at a window and fear the man standing behind it again." Amara looked at the ring, a deep, midnight band that looked as unbreakable and forbidding as the man offering it. A pain so old it had become part of her soul flared in her chest. She thought of her mother, Lydia, who was likely at that very moment scrubbing a floor or nursing a fresh bruise while Marcus Hale watched her with his cold indifference and detached, judgmental stare. The guilt of being warm, of lying on silk sheets that probably cost more than her rent, while her mother was freezing in a home that had become a prison, was a weight more suffocating than the snow that had nearly buried her. "No," she whispered, throwing the blanket off and swinging her legs to the floor. Her knees buckled instantly, the lingering effects of the hypothermia making her body feel like lead, but she gripped the edge of the nightstand until her knuckles turned white, refusing to let him see her fall again. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to buy a life that doesn't belong to you and think that makes the world right. You found me at my lowest, but I am not for sale." June Hyuk did not reach for her. He remembered that about her, the way she would rather collapse than accept a hand she didn't ask for, the way her stubborn self-reliance was the only thing she had left to call her own. "It is not a purchase, Amara. It is a sanctuary." "A sanctuary for one is a prison for the other," she spat, her voice gaining a resonant strength that defied her physical weakness. She stood her ground, her curly hair framing a face that was now set in a mask of absolute defiance. "I will not be a bride in a gilded fortress while my mother is being dismantled by that man. Marcus Hale threw me out because I was the only thing standing between his fist and her face. He shoved me into that blizzard because I refused to let her learn her lesson in the cold anymore. If I stay here and play queen while she is still his victim, I am no better than he is." She took a precarious step toward him, her breathing sharp and uneven, her eyes locked onto his dark, unreadable ones. "If you want me, June Hyuk, if you really want this ring on my finger, then you earn it. You go to that house. You take my mother out of his reach. You bring her to a place where he can never, ever find her again. You save her from that icy cold house he calls a home. Until she is safe, until she can breathe without permission, I am not your bride. I am just a debt you're trying to settle." The silence that followed was like a wire pulled so tight it vibrated with the threat of snapping. June Hyuk stood slowly, his tall, athletic build casting a shadow that swallowed the morning light on the bed. He walked to the window, pressing one hand flat against the cold glass as he looked out over the city of Seoul, which glowed beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered but never truly enjoyed. His fingers curled slowly against the glass, his mind already calculating the logistics of a restructuring that would leave no fingerprints, but would ensure Marcus Hale's absolute ruin. "You have my word," he said without turning around, his voice dropping to a whisper that held the weight of an immutable fact. "Tomorrow, she will be safe. I will have my people bring her things, and I will ensure he never has the chance to look at her through a window again. He will never send either of you into the cold." "Then we will talk," Amara said, her jaw clenched as she watched his silhouette. "But not until she is here, not until she is free." June Hyuk turned then, and for exactly 1 second, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped. The look in his eyes was raw and unguarded, filled with a patient and terrible certainty that made Amara realize she wasn't just a girl he found in the snow, she was the only thing that made him want to be something other than the monster the world had made him. He watched her the way a man reads something sacred, afraid to miss a single word or a single breath. "I can wait," he said quietly. "I've waited 5 years to find you again. I can wait 1 more day to make you mine." He walked toward the door, his movements controlled and lethal, but as he passed her, he paused. He didn't touch her, but the air between them turned ice cold with the intensity of his focus. "Rest, Amara. You'll need your strength for the life we're going to build. Because once your mother is safe, I am never letting you leave again." As the door clicked shut behind him, Amara sank back onto the silk sheets, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had made her bargain, but as she looked at the black titanium ring still sitting on the nightstand, she wondered if she had traded one kind of cage for another, and if June Hyuk's protection would be the very thing that finally broke her. The silence of the penthouse sanctuary was too heavy, too perfect, and it served only as a cold, polished canvas for the ghosts Amara Hayes had spent years trying to outrun. As the heavy door clicked shut, and June Hyuk left to coordinate the shadows of his empire, Amara sank back into the vast expanse of white silk sheets. She closed her eyes, but the scent of the lilies in the room didn't bring peace. Instead, the fragrance seemed to warp and shift until it was replaced by the sharp, clinical smell of antiseptic, and the peppermint tea her father used to drink to settle a nausea that never truly left him. Her father, David Hayes, had been a man of quiet, scholarly strength who looked at the world as a series of adventures waiting to be mapped. Amara remembered the early years, before the hospital corridors, when their small apartment was filled with his laughter and the rustle of old books. But the adventure had been torn apart when he was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. Amara's childhood hadn't ended with a single event, but in the rhythmic, sterile hum of dialysis machines and the sight of her vibrant father being peeled away, layer by layer. She had watched him transform into a shadow of himself, a man of black coffee and no smiles, who was tethered to a bed by tubes and a failing spirit. Her mother, Lydia, had transformed too, becoming a woman of life-tired exhaustion who spent her nights counting the seconds between his weak, shallow exhales. When David finally passed, the vacuum he left behind was so vast that it felt like the very walls of their home were pressing inward, suffocating them both in a grief they couldn't afford. It was into that vacuum that Marcus Hale stepped, carrying a false promise of air. He had arrived as a family friend, a man with hard, stern features and a solid build that looked, to two drowning women, like a pillar of stability. He brought groceries when Lydia was too exhausted and hungry to move. He fixed the leaky faucets that David had been too weak to touch. To Lydia, Marcus felt like the return of color to a gray world. He was the only soft thing in a life made of sharp edges, or so he had convinced her for those first few months. He promised Lydia a life where she would never have to be the caretaker again, where she could finally rest in a home that wasn't defined by sickness. But the rest was a carefully laid trap, and the adventure turned into danger the moment the front door was locked behind them. Amara remembered the exact night the mask slipped. It was a rainy Tuesday, barely 3 months after the wedding. Marcus had come home with a weathered face and a gaze that was no longer supportive, but detached and judgmental. Lydia had made a small mistake. She had been working for 12 hours straight and forgot to buy a specific brand of coffee. Marcus hadn't shouted at first. He had simply walked over to the kitchen counter, and with a slow, deliberate motion that was more terrifying than a scream, swept every porcelain cup onto the tile until they shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're useless without someone telling you what to do, aren't you?" he had hissed, his voice a low vibration that made Amara's skin crawl. When Amara had stepped forward to pull her mother away from the broken glass, Marcus had looked at her not as a daughter, but as a disposable obstacle to be moved. From that night on, the golden glow of their home was a mask for a gilded fortress that had become a prison of sharp edges. He systematically isolated them, cutting her hours and making sure they were always barely keeping their eyes open from exhaustion and fear. Every time Amara tried to defend her mother, Marcus would remind her that she had nothing left, and that he was the only thing keeping them from the street, until the night he finally made good on the threat and shoved her into the blizzard. Amara opened her eyes in the present, the memory of her father's soft voice now drowned out by the phantom sound of Marcus's hand hitting the door frame as he pointed her toward the snow. She looked at the silk curtains of the penthouse and realized the bitter irony of her life. She had spent years being broken by a man who used a house as a cage, only to be rescued by a man who used an entire city as his kingdom. She thought of Lydia, still trapped in that icy cold house with a man who watched her walk into the snow and didn't care if she lived or died. The fury and fear and pain so old rose in her chest, but this time it was tempered by the memory of June Hyuk's focused concern and the way he had wrapped his coat around her without thinking. Her father had been too weak to protect them, and Marcus had used his strength to destroy them. But June Hyuk, the man with blood on his hands that no amount of money could wash off, was the only one who had ever knelt in the ice to pick her up. "My father died because his body gave up," Amara whispered to the empty, luxury-filled room, her fingers curling into the silk of the mattress. "But Marcus is taking my mother's life because he likes the way it feels to watch her break." She sat up, her jaw clenched with a tightness she had learned from the man who was now out there, dismantling Marcus's world piece by piece. She wasn't just a girl who had been thrown away anymore. She was the only woman June Hyuk had ever loved, and she was going to use his patient and terrible power to ensure that her mother never had to stand in the cold again. The shadows of her father were fading, replaced by the dark, unyielding silhouette of the Mafia boss who had turned the blizzard into her sanctuary. The sky over the outskirts of Seoul remained a bruised, heavy purple, the clouds still pregnant with the remnants of the blizzard as June Hyuk's tactical team moved with the silent, predatory grace of smoke. Inside the black sedan parked a block away from the house, The air was thick with the scent of cedar and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the biting cold that pressed against the windows. Jun Hyuk sat in the back seat, his jaw tight and his dark eyes fixed on the live feed from the drones hovering invisibly above Marcus Hale's property. He was a man who moved with precision that left no fingerprints. And tonight, that precision was directed at a target he found personally offensive. Inside the house, the atmosphere was ice cold despite the heater's hum. Marcus Hale stood in the center of the living room, his hard, stern features twisted into a mask of unhinged irritation. He was packing the floorboards, the floor creaking under his solid build as he looked at Lydia, who was huddled on the sofa, her hands trembling as she clutched a lukewarm cup of tea. The detached, judgmental stare he leveled at her was the same one he had used when he shoved Amara into the snow. "She isn't coming back, Lydia," Marcus hissed, his voice a low vibration of petty cruelty. "She's probably a frozen corpse in a gutter by now because she was too stubborn to learn her lesson. And you're going to be next if you don't start acting like you have a reason to be in my house." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a shadow of a monster, and Lydia flinched, her eyes glossy as if on the verge of tears. She was life-tired, her spirit hollowed out by years of being nothing more than a shadow tethered to Marcus's whims. Marcus reached out, his hand curling into a fist as he prepared to dismantle her once more, but he never got the chance. The front door didn't just open, it vanished. With a sound like a raid gone wrong, Jun Hyuk's men breached the house from 3 different points simultaneously. There were no shouts, no chaotic noise, only the rhythmic, terrifying sound of professional soldiers moving through a space they already owned. Marcus froze, his weathered face turning a sickly shade of gray as he looked into the muzzles of 3 suppressed rifles. He tried to speak, to assert the authority he had built through fear, but his voice died in his throat as the lead guard, a man who had seen Jun Hyuk carry injured men through doors, stepped forward. "Marcus Hale," the guard said, his voice as controlled and lethal as his employer. "You are no longer the one who decides who stays and who goes." While 2 guards pinned Marcus against the wall with precision that left no room for escape, a 3rd man stepped toward Lydia. He didn't reach for her with the sharp edges of violence, but with a quiet reverence that made her breath catch. He wrapped a thick wool scarf and a long, black cashmere coat around her shoulders, garments that smelled of the same sanctuary where Amara was currently resting. "Your daughter is safe," the guard whispered, his focused concern acting as the first true breath of air Lydia had felt in years. "And now, so are you." As they led Lydia toward the waiting armored vehicle, Jun Hyuk's forensic accountants and lieutenants began the systematic dismantling of Marcus's life. They didn't just take his prisoner, they took his world. Within minutes, they had seized his records legally obtained from the Home Office, documenting the skimming of deposits and falsifying of invoices he had used to fund his lifestyle of terror. They hacked into his offshore accounts, redirecting every cent back into the legitimate channels Jun Hyuk controlled. By the time Lydia's car pulled away, Marcus Hale was standing in a house that no longer belonged to him, in a life that had been erased from the map. Jun Hyuk stepped out of his sedan as the guards dragged Marcus toward the second car. The snow hit his face, but he didn't feel it. His gaze was patient and terrible, locked on the man who had dared to make his queen wake up afraid. He didn't strike Marcus. He didn't need to. The certainty in his eyes was a death sentence more absolute than any blow. "You thought she was disposable," Jun Hyuk said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that made the air feel thin. "But she is the only soft thing in my world, and for what you did to her, I am going to ensure you rot in a cell until you forget the sound of your own name." Marcus began to cry and beg, his judgmental stare replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered panic, but Jun Hyuk had already turned away. He watched the vehicle carrying Lydia disappear into the amber glow of the streetlights, his mind already moving to the final verdict he would allow Amara to deliver. The 3-year winter was over, and as he climbed back into his car, he knew the war was not about territory, but about the woman who had shown him there was a version of life worth saving. The black sedan moved through the outskirts of Seoul, cutting through the slush of the melting storm as it pulled into the yard of a derelict warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The air inside the vehicle was thick with the scent of June Hyuk's expensive cologne, cedar and smoke, a fragrance that had become Amara's only anchor in a world that had shifted too fast from a frozen porch to a mafia penthouse. June Hyuk sat beside her, his presence calm but his eyes holding that patient and terrible intensity she was beginning to understand. He didn't speak as the driver opened her door, but he reached out, his hand steadying her shoulder in a gesture of focused concern, a silent promise that the sharp edges of the world would not cut her tonight. Inside the warehouse, the light was harsh and flickering, casting long, jagged shadows against the corrugated metal walls that hummed with the vibration of the wind outside. In the center of the room, Marcus Hale was no longer the imposing silhouette that had loomed in the window of her childhood home, watching her walk into the snow with cold indifference. He was zip-tied to a heavy wooden chair, his weathered face gray and slick with sweat. The hard, stern features that had once terrorized Amara and her mother were now twisted in a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. As Amara stepped into the circle of light, Marcus's gaze found her. He didn't sneer. He didn't bark a command or shove a clipboard into her hands. Instead, he began to sob. The sound was high and pathetic, a jagged contrast to the man who had once swept porcelain cups onto the floor just to see them shatter while telling her she was disposable. "Amara, please," he choked out, his chest heaving as he scanned the silent, armed men standing in the shadows of the warehouse. "I didn't know. I didn't mean it. It was the stress, the cold. I was just angry because I didn't want to lose you. Please tell them to stop. Tell them I'm family." He began to beg, his voice cracking as he recounted the years he had provided for them, trying to twist the narrative of their abuse into a story of misunderstood burden. He looked at her with glossy, desperate eyes, pleading for the same mercy she had shown him 1,000 times when she had stepped between his hand and Lydia's face in that icy cold house. He was crying and begging, a man who had realized too late that the woman he treated like trash was the only thing standing between him and a man who moved like smoke and dealt in destruction. Amara stood still, her fingers curling into the soft cashmere of the coat June Hyuk had given her, the fabric a shield that Marcus's voice couldn't penetrate. Beside her, June Hyuk remained a calm authority amid chaos, his jaw tight as he watched Marcus with the kind of stillness that always preceded a negotiation gone wrong. He looked at Amara, waiting for the signal to let his men finish the systematic dismantling they had started at the house. But as Marcus's cries filled the room, Amara felt the heavy, unfulfilled weight of her own, kind-hearted mercy. She looked at the man who had made her life-tired and saw not a monster, but a broken, pathetic coward who was now asleep and unaware of the true gravity of his sins. The anger that had sustained her in the snow began to dissolve into a weary, familiar pity. She couldn't be like him. She couldn't watch another human being break in the dark, even if they had spent years breaking her piece by piece. Her stubborn self-reliance had kept her alive, but it was her heart that made her different from the man in the chair. "Stop," she whispered, her voice small but resonant in the cavernous space. June Hyuk's gaze shifted to her, his brow furrowing as he looked at her soft, natural features. "He nearly killed you, Amara. He is the reason your mother was a prisoner in her own home, barely keeping her eyes open from fear." "I know," she said, her breath hitching as she looked back at Marcus, who was now nodding frantically, his tears dripping onto the casual indoor shirt that highlighted he had no outerwear against the cold reality of his situation. "But if we do this, if you let them hurt him like this, we're just like him. We're just using fear as a currency. Please, June Hyuk, just let him go. Let him see that we've won without becoming the sharp edges ourselves." June Hyuk's fingers curled slowly against his knee, the knuckles deep but clean from a history of violence he was trying to leave behind for her. He saw her eyes slightly glossy as if on the verge of tears, and realized that his power was not for hurting people she pitied, but for protecting the peace she wanted. For a moment, the silence was unbearable, pressing against the corrugated walls like water rising in a room with no exit. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, June Hyuk stood up. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked only at Amara, his expression one of terrifyingly soft reverence. "For you," he said quietly, the words sounding like a vow he would carry into their new reign. He signaled to his men with a sharp, clinical flick of his wrist to cut the ties. Marcus collapsed to the floor, babbling his thanks and moving like smoke in the opposite direction, a man who had been spared by a mercy he would never truly understand. Amara watched him go, believing in that moment that her kindness had finally closed the door on their nightmare, unaware that Marcus was already planning his next attempt to reclaim the disposable lives he thought he owned. As Marcus disappeared into the night, Amara turned to June Hyuk, her hands trembling or clasped together as the adrenaline faded. June Hyuk didn't say he told her so. He simply reached out and took her hand, his pulse against her fingertips steady and strong. The emotional wall between them was no longer a barrier but a bridge. "He's gone," she whispered, wanting to believe the winter was finally over. "He's gone, and he'll never hurt her again." June Hyuk didn't answer right away. He just looked at the door Marcus had fled through, his jaw tight with the certainty that some men only understand the language of the cold. The drive back from the warehouse was draped in a heavy, contemplative silence, the city lights of Seoul flickering past the window like a reel of a life Amara Hayes no longer recognized. Beside her, June Hyuk Kang remained a calm authority, his posture relaxed but his focus entirely on the woman whose mercy had just spared a monster. He did not question her decision to release Marcus, nor did he lecture her on the dangers of a kind heart. Instead, the way his fingers grazed the leather of the armrest suggested he was already planning the layers of protection she didn't yet know she needed. The air inside the car was warm, but the fury and fear and pain so old still sat in the back of Amara's throat, a reminder that the blizzard wasn't just a weather event, but a season of her life that was only just beginning to change. They arrived at the guarded sanctuary, a secluded estate on the outskirts of the city that looked more like a fortress of glass and stone than a house. As the iron gates hissed shut behind them, Amara felt the first real breath of air reach her lungs since the night her stepfather had shoved her into the snow. June Hyuk led her inside, where the warmth was immediate, and the scent of fresh lilies replaced the metallic, industrial tang of the warehouse. It was a space of white marble and soft, charcoal silks, designed to hold the world at bay. In the center of the living room stood Lydia. She looked fragile, her hands trembling or clasped together as she stood in a simple cardigan that mirrored the one Amara had worn during her collapse. The life-tired exhaustion in her mother's eyes had begun to soften, replaced by a fragile, disbelieving light. When she saw Amara, a sound of broken relief escaped her, and they collided in a desperate embrace. For the first time in years, there was no sound of a heavy, judgmental footfall in the hallway to fear, no watcher inside the window to monitor their every move. June Hyuk stood back, watching the reunion with a focused concern that made Amara's heart ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. He had moved Lydia here with the same precision that left no fingerprints. He used to dismantle empires, ensuring she had a private doctor and staff who moved with a quiet reverence that didn't ask for credit. He had turned his world into a shield for two women who had spent their lives being told they were disposable. Later that evening, after Lydia had finally fallen into a deep, safe sleep in a room with silk sheets and a heater that hummed a lullaby, Amara found June Hyuk on the terrace. The snow had stopped, leaving the world white and still beneath a pale winter moon that turned the garden into an amber-lit painting. He was leaning against the stone railing, his light-colored trench coat dusted with the remnants of the night's frost, his sharp jawline and strong cheekbones silhouetted against the dark sky. Amara walked up beside him, her footsteps silent on the heated stone. She looked at the tattoos that traced the strength of his neck, marks of a world built on gunfire and broken glass. And yet, all she could see was the man who had dropped to his knees in the ice for her. The stubborn self-reliance that had been her only defense for 5 years began to feel like a weight she could finally put down. "You didn't have to do any of this," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that finally cracked the emotional wall she had built between them. "You could have just left me in the street. You could have ignored what he was doing to my mother." June Hyuk turned to her, his dark, unreadable eyes locking on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in weak, broken clouds, even in the warmth of the terrace. He did not reach for her, respecting the distance she had maintained, but his presence was a vow of silk and ink in itself. "I told you, Amara," he said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp that signaled a decision already made. "I don't let the only soft thing in a life made entirely of sharp edges freeze. I watched you fight for her for years from the shadows. I'm not watching anymore." For the first time since she was 23 and fresh out of university, Amara didn't pull away. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing the cashmere of his sleeve, and felt the pulse in his wrist, steady, strong, and entirely dedicated to her safety. The certainty in his gaze, the one she had once feared, now felt like the only thing keeping the world from collapsing again. "You rescued her," Amara said, her eyes slightly glossy as if on the verge of tears. "And you brought me back." "I brought you home," he corrected her, his hand finally moving to cover hers. "The rest is just noise." In that moment, the ghosts, gunfire, and broken glass of their past felt 1,000 miles away. Amara looked at the man who was a monster to the city but a sanctuary to her, and she felt the last jagged piece of her resistance crumble. She realized that while she had spent her life trying to be a shield for her mother, June Hyuk was the only person who had ever thought she was worth shielding, too. As they stood together in the quiet, steady fall of the winter night, the vow between them was no longer about a debt or a bargain. It was about the impossible survival of two people who had finally found a version of life that didn't have to look like their father's. The snow had not stopped, but it had changed its character. What was once a lethal, predatory blizzard had softened into a quiet, steady fall that turned the sprawling grounds of the estate into a white, still painting. Inside the guarded sanctuary, Amara Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching her own reflection in the glass and trying to recognize the woman staring back. She was no longer the girl in the damp cardigan, the disposable, human shield for her mother. She was draped in the warmth of a world that didn't ask her to bleed for her safety. She didn't hear June Hyuk come into the room. He moved like smoke, a silent authority that had spent a lifetime learning to traverse sharp edges without making a sound. "Come with me," he said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp that no longer felt like a threat to her survival, but like a beckoning into his kingdom. He was standing by the door, still in his boots, his hands in his pockets, and his presence held a focused concern that acted as the first true breath of air she had felt in years. Amara hesitated, her mind flashing back to the icy pavement where her body had originally given out, her breath coming in weak, broken clouds as Marcus watched from the warm window. "The last time I was out in the snow, I nearly died," she whispered, her fingers curling into the silk of her sleeve. "I know," June Hyuk replied, his dark eyes locked on hers with a protective intensity that seemed to hold the weight of the 5 years they had lost. "That is why we are going now, to show the winter that you are no longer alone." He opened the hall closet and pulled out a coat Amara had never seen before. It was a long, black cashmere piece, heavy enough to stop the cold dead in its tracks. It wasn't his. It was perfectly tailored to her size, a garment that represented a vow of silk and ink. He had made the moment he found her in the drifts. He held it open behind her, not because she was incapable, but because he wanted to be the one to provide the barrier between her and the world's cruelty. As she slid her arms into the silk lining, the fabric felt like a promise. It smelled of cedar and smoke, the scent of him, and as he lifted her curly hair out from under the collar, his fingers barely brushed the back of her neck. The touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the frost outside. It was the feeling of an emotional wall finally crumbling. He wrapped a thick wool scarf around her jaw, his hands working with a terrifyingly soft reverence, his face so close she could see the sharp jawline and the focused concern in his gaze. "Now you are ready," he said quietly, his breath making clouds in the amber glow of the hallway. They walked out into the crisp, night air, their footsteps crunched in unison on the private path. The cold hit Amara's face, but it didn't reach her body. The cashmere shield held everything out, acting as a cashmere shield against the ghosts of her past. June Hyuk didn't try to guide her with a touch. He simply walked beside her, matching her pace and letting her lead the way through the trees that were heavy with snow. "Marcus Hale made you believe you were disposable because he was a small man who needed to feel big by making you cold," June Hyuk said, his voice dropping to a whisper that held the weight of an immutable fact. He stopped, turning to face her beneath the streetlights that turned the falling snow into amber dust. "But look at this estate. Look at the men standing at the gate who move at my word. All of this, the power that makes boardrooms fall silent, is now your own. My world is the wall between you and anyone who ever tries to make you freeze again." Amara looked up as a branch released a small shower of snow that dusted her shoulders. For the first time in years, she smiled, a small, real expression that reached her glossy eyes. She realized then that Jun Hyuk wasn't trying to win her like a territory. He was refusing to let her freeze in any sense of the word, whether by the weather or by the petty cruelty of men like Marcus. "He thought I had nothing left," Amara said, her voice resonant and steady in the quiet of the night. "He thought if he threw me out, the world would finish what he started." "He didn't know that I was waiting at the corner," Jun Hyuk replied, his jaw tight with a patient and terrible fury that was now her greatest asset. He reached out, his pulse against her fingertips steady and strong as he adjusted the collar of her coat. "He didn't know that by throwing you into the snow. He was handing me the only thing I ever wanted back." They stood there for a long moment, the snow falling between them like a curtain that was finally being pulled back. Amara felt the stubborn self-reliance that had been her only defense for 5 years start to transform. It wasn't that she was weak, but that she no longer had to be the only one fighting. The cashmere wasn't just fabric. It was the physical manifestation of Jun Hyuk's power, a power she was finally allowing herself to touch. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying a weight that finally cracked the last of her resistance. "It is not a gift, Amara," he corrected, his hand finally moving to cover hers, their shoulders almost touching as they turned back toward the house. "It is a right. From this night on, you walk in the warmth, and those who hurt you will be the ones left in the cold." As they walked back side by side, close enough that their shoulders fully touched this time, Amara knew that the 3-year winter of Marcus Hale's reign was truly over. She was no longer the girl on the porch. She was the woman in the black cashmere coat, and she was walking back into a kingdom where she would finally be the one to decide how the story ended. The air inside the private chapel was thick with the scent of white lilies and the quiet, resonant hum of a life finally beginning to thaw. Amara Hayes stood at the altar, her breath no longer coming in weak, broken clouds, but steady and rhythmic as she looked into the dark, unreadable eyes of Jun Hyuk Kang. She wore a gown of heavy white silk that draped over her like a second skin, a stark contrast to the thin, damp cardigan she had been wearing when Jun Hyuk first found her trembling on the icy pavement. Beside her, Lydia sat in the front row, her hands no longer clasped in terror, but resting softly on her lap. The sanctuary Jun Hyuk had provided over the last few weeks had worked its magic. The hollow, life-tired look in her mother's eyes had been replaced by a fragile, hopeful light. The ceremony was intimate, a gilded fortress of safety that seemed impenetrable to the outside world, yet the atmospheric tension remained high, as if the winter outside was still waiting for a crack in the glass. But Marcus Hale was a man who dealt in the currency of obsession, a predator who couldn't stand to see his disposable property find a throne. He had moved like smoke through the service entrance, his weathered face twisted into a mask of desperate, unhinged rage. He believed that because Amara had shown him kind-hearted mercy in the warehouse, the soft features of her heart were a weakness he could exploit one last time. His plan was simple and brutal. Take Lydia back, use her as a human shield, and force Amara to crawl back to the sharp edges of his domestic terror. He crept through the shadows of the narthex, his casual indoor shirt damp from the melting slush, his eyes locked on the woman he still believed he owned. He reached the front row, just as the vows began, his hand darting out to grab Lydia's arm with a strength that reignited the fury and fear of the past 5 years. But the moment his fingers brushed her sleeve, the planned backfire snapped shut like a steel trap. Jun Hyuk didn't flinch, nor did his posture shift. He simply tightened his grip on Amara's hand, his thumb tracing a steady, possessive line over her knuckles. He had seen allies who barely survived negotiations gone wrong before, and he had spent 3 days ensuring that Marcus Hale would never be a threat again. The 2 guests sitting directly behind Lydia were not family. They were Jun Hyuk's most elite security, men who had seen him carry injured men through doors and knew exactly how to handle a man like Marcus. Before Marcus could even pull Lydia from her seat, he was surrounded. The calm authority of Jun Hyuk's world moved in silence, with a precision that left no fingerprints and no room for escape. One guard pinned Marcus's arms behind his back, while another stepped between him and the terrified mother he had tried to reclaim. There was no gunfire, no shouting, only the rhythmic, terrifying sound of a man being erased from a room he was never meant to enter. Marcus began to struggle, his chest heaving as he realized his judgmental stare no longer held any power in this kingdom. He looked at Amara, his eyes glossy and pleading, hopping for the same hand of mercy that had spared him in the dark warehouse. But as Amara looked back at him, she didn't feel the familiar, weary pity. She felt the weight of the black cashmere coat she had worn in the snow, the symbol of a power that was now her own. She looked at the man who had tried to kidnap her mother on her wedding day, and saw only the shadow of a monster she was finally ready to burn down. The ceremony did not stop. Jun Hyuk leaned in, his jaw tight, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp that made the air feel thin. "It is your choice, Amara," he whispered, his eyes locked on hers with a focused concern that respected her transformation. "Do we show him the mercy he expects, or do we provide the certainty he deserves?" Amara looked at her mother, who was now standing, supported by a guard, her face pale but her gaze fixed on her daughter with a newfound strength. Amara turned back to Marcus, her expression hardening into the final outcome of a woman who was no longer a victim. She remembered the cold of the porch, the way the snow had buried her shoes within seconds, and the way Marcus had watched her collapse and then turned away. She realized that her kind-hearted mercy had been a gift he had tried to weaponize. "You don't get to decide who stays and who goes anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice resonant and clear in the quiet of the chapel. "The only choice left is yours, and you've already made it." Jun Hyuk signaled his men with a sharp, clinical flick of his wrist. As Marcus was dragged out through the side entrance, babbling his thanks for a mercy he mistakenly thought was coming, Jun Hyuk turned back to the priest. The silence of the chapel returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was a new reign of peace built on the impossible survival of two people who loved each other enough to try again. Amara laced her fingers through Jun Hyuk's, her shoulders touching his fully this time, and as the vows continued, she felt the last emotional wall between them crack and disappear. The 3-year winter of Marcus Hale's reign was truly over. Behind them, the snow was already melting, and ahead of them, the city stretched wide, bright, and waiting. Amara knew that the man being hauled toward a waiting armored vehicle would never see the inside of her world again. She had chosen her sanctuary, and as the priest pronounced them husband and wife, she knew she had finally found a version of life that didn't have to look like her father's. The heavy iron doors of the chapel corridor closed with a final, echoing thud, swallowing Marcus's muffled pleas for a mercy that no longer lived within Amara's heart. The silence that followed was not the hollow, fearful quiet of the house on the porch, but a serene, absolute stillness that signaled the end of a long, cold war. Amara stood at the altar, her fingers laced through Jun Hyuk's, her pulse steady against his palm as she looked at her mother. Lydia was trembling, but she was standing upright, her eyes fixed on her daughter with a clarity that had been missing since the day David Hayes died. The 2 security guards who had neutralized Marcus remained in the room, their expressions as unreadable as the sharp jawline of the man standing beside Amara. One of them stepped forward and handed a phone to Jun Hyuk, the screen glowing with a call from the secure holding area. Jun Hyuk didn't look at the device. He looked only at Amara, his dark eyes searching hers with a protective intensity that respected her choice above all else. "He is being held in the lower level," Jun Hyuk said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp. "He is desperate, Amara. He is begging for one last word with you, claiming he has information about your father's final days. You don't have to see him. I can ensure he is delivered to the financial crimes prosecutor without another word from you. Or I can ensure he simply disappears into the shadows of my world." Amara thought of the girl who had collapsed on the icy pavement, the one who had spent years being a human shield and believing she was disposable. She thought of the kind-hearted mercy she had shown in the warehouse and how that very kindness had been twisted into an opportunity for more violence. She realized then that true mercy wasn't sparing a predator. It was providing the certainty of permanent justice for the victims he hunted. She looked at Lydia, whose hands were finally still, and she knew that if Marcus Hale was allowed even a sliver of hope, the winter would never truly end. "I want to see him," Amara said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying the authority of the throne Jun Hyuk had offered her. "But not to listen. I want him to hear the final verdict." Jun Hyuk nodded once, a gesture of absolute alignment. They moved through the chapel and down into the secure wing of the estate, where the air was cool and smelled of fresh paint and digital security. Marcus Hale was slumped in a chair in a small, windowless room, his weathered face, a ruin of tears and sweat. The moment the door opened and Amara entered in her white silk gown, he fell to his knees, his casual indoor shirt damp with the physical manifestation of his fear. "Amara, baby, please," he sobbed, reaching for the hem of her dress with hands that had once swept porcelain cups onto the floor just to see them shatter. "I was just scared of losing you. I did it all for the family. I've changed, I swear it. If you send me to jail, I'll never survive. Just let me go to the States, I'll never call, I'll never look for Lydia again. Please, for the sake of your father's memory, don't do this." Amara stepped back, the fabric of her gown whisking away from his touch with a sound like a closing door. She looked at the man who had turned her home into a prison and realized he was not a king, or a god, or even a worthy enemy. He was just a small, cruel man who had run out of people to hurt. She felt the stubborn self-reliance of her past 5 years consolidate into a cold, sharp edge. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of terrifyingly soft certainty that mirrored June Hyuk. "You won't be coming back, but it's not because I'm letting you go. It's because I'm making sure you rot in a cell for every minute of fear you put into my mother's life. You sent me out to die in the snow because you thought I had nothing left, but you were wrong. I had exactly enough to bring you down." She turned to June Hyuk, her expression hardening into the final transformation of a woman who was no longer a victim. "Give the files to the prosecutor. The embezzlement, the domestic assault, the kidnapping attempt, and the labor violations, all of it. I want him to see the evidence of every life he tried to dismantle. Make sure he never comes out." June Hyuk's jaw tightened, his focused concern shifting into a grim satisfaction. "It is done. The warrant is already being processed, and my lawyers have ensured there is no bail." As Marcus was dragged away, his screams for mercy echoing through the sterile corridor until they were silenced by a heavy security door, Amara felt the last of the life-tired, exhaustion lift from her shoulders. She walked back into the chapel, where Lydia was waiting in the pale winter sunlight that now streamed through the glass. Her mother reached out, taking Amara's hand, and for the first time since David Hayes' death, both of them were safe in a world that didn't ask them to be shields. The 3-year winter of Marcus Hale's reign had finally melted, replaced by a new version of life that wasn't built on power or pain, but on the stubborn, impossible survival of 2 people who had found a protector in the shadows. June Hyuk stepped in beside Amara, his shoulder touching hers fully this time, and as they walked toward the car, the city of souls stretched ahead of them, wide, bright, and finally their own. "Are you ready?" June Hyuk asked, his hand finding hers and holding on with a grip that was no longer about holding her back, but about moving forward together. Amara looked at her mother, who was smiling at the snow-covered trees, and then at the man who had knelt in the ice to pick her up. "I've been ready for 5 years," she said. The car pulled into the road, leaving the ghosts of the porch and the warehouse behind. Ahead of them, something new was beginning, something built not on fear, but on the quiet, stubborn love of 2 people who had fought the world and finally won their peace.